So welcome everyone. My name is Tara and I run the Repair Clark County program for Columbia Springs. So tonight I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to talk a little bit about Columbia Springs and our program, and then talk about the chats, and then pass it over to Mike. So Repair Clark County is a program that fixes people's broken stuff for free. And there are many repair programs across the country. This is just Clark County, Washington's version of it. And we fix broken stuff in 5 different categories, as you see here. So appliances, electronics, sewing, sharpening, and then other. And other is things like jewelry or home decor. It can be clocks, those types of things. The only things that we don't fix are microwaves, gas engines, and Christmas light strings, because they're just basically not worth it. And then you'll see here, so we used to, pre-COVID, we used to actually have 2-hour events out in our community. And then post-COVID is this picture on the right here. That's my ride, and it's completely stuffed to the gills with broken stuff. Of course, most of that stuff got fixed and was returned. So we are doing a program now that we're calling Repair Goes Remote. And that is, you would drop off your items at one of 4 different local library branches. And then we pick it up, as you see here in the picture, and bring it back. And then our fixers repair your stuff in their own space at their own pace. And then we will return your hopefully fixed items back to the library branches, and then you can pick them up whenever they're open. So that's kind of the evolution, the COVID evolution of our program. I wanted to quickly talk about Columbia Springs as well. So April's on the line. She's helping with the slides. And April and I both work for Columbia Springs. And Columbia Springs, if you've never been here, please go check it out. If it's been a while, please go check it out. This is your official invite. It's a 100-acre outdoor and environmental education center. We have trails. There's a feeding pond with humongous rainbow trout in it. That's super fun. Again, pre-COVID, we used to do lots of education. And post-COVID, we're doing a lot of virtual programming, and our trails are open. So you can still go check it out and enjoy your time down there. It's a really fantastic place to get nature time without really having to leave the city at all. Just a couple of notes about how those workshops going to work. So Mike will be presenting the content, and then he's going to pause after each section. And if there's any questions that myself or one of our fixers was not able to answer in the chat, we will, I'll field those to Mike. And then we do have a ton of content to cover tonight. We're going to try to fit it all into an hour and a half, but we are already considering an advanced class. I'm pretty sure that I say considering, but I'm pretty sure it's going to happen. I think Mike has a lot of stuff that he wants to share with you that we know we're not going to get to tonight. And then I've already mentioned it, but I just wanted to mention it again. The class is being recorded, and it'll be put up on the Columbia Springs YouTube channel, and whenever we can get to it. And then at the very bottom here in humongous letters, that is the best way to get into contact with me. If you have any questions, suggestions, topics, if you have any questions about the repair program, how it's working now, things that we can repair, things that we can't, anything like that, please do reach out to me. And I think that was my last slide. Oh, I wanted to quickly say, you'll be getting a survey afterwards. If you are in a position to make a monetary donation towards Columbia Springs, that is amazing. We will never say no to that. And then again, there's my email. And then I'm gonna turn it back over to Mike. So I'm gonna stop share and stop myself and take it away, Mike.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Looks like we've got, wow, 37 people. I guess I better perform properly here. We wanted to talk about hand tools today. I'm not going to cover power tools. And the problem with hand tools is there's so many different types of hand tools. It's an amazing number and reasons for having them. Part of the reasons there are so many, I mean, I guess I could go really quick and say, there's a hammer for pounding, and there's pliers for pinching, and maybe a screwdriver for turning. But unfortunately, over the years, tools have migrated because, it started out that, the original pair of pliers didn't quite do the job. So they keep iterating and getting better and changing and doing specific things. So because of that, There's just a huge number of tools out there. And we're going to cover some of the basic categories of them. Hopefully this is going to be something that everyone's going to be able to learn something, even if you're an expert. I know putting the class together, I learned a few things. And the good news is when you get done with this, hopefully you're going to be able to do some simple repairs or be able to maybe even do things better than what you've done before. And to start with, many of the tools that were created are for dealing with fasteners, things like nuts and bolts and screws. So I thought what I would do is start by talking about fasteners a little bit, just so that we can have a, oops, let me change the camera here, so that we can have a better understanding of what we're talking about. So when it comes to fasteners, April, if you can start the fastener one. There's many different types of fasteners. There's nuts and bolts and screws. And one of the questions that often come up, and again, I apologize as far as the camera goes. It is an autofocus. I promise to try to stop and let the autofocus happen. Sometimes because I get so excited about talking about tools, I may not. If things are blurry, I apologize. Tara promises to stop me and say, Mike, slow down, make sure you hold the thing. So bear with me if I do things wrong. But so again, let's talk about bolts and screws. What is the difference between a bolt and a screw? Well, unfortunately, the lines have been blurred a little bit sometimes, but bolts are typically fasteners that go into unthreaded objects. So you would put this through a hole, and then you would have a nut that holds it together, to where a screw typically is something that would be screwed into wood or metal or something, and it'll actually create the threads, but it doesn't require a nut or anything on the other end. That's really the difference between a bolt and a screw in its highest definition. But there are other types of screws, as a wood screw is a perfect example of that type of screw. This is a wood screw. A wood screw usually has a coarse threaded screw threads here, and then there will be a smooth part at the top, to where this is called a machine screw. Now, this looks like a bolt, and really, under the classic definition, it is a bolt, but they call it a screw, typically because it's a smaller type of bolt. These are called machine screws. You might be wondering what this smooth part up at the top of a wood screw is. Well, that is for the piece of wood that you're putting it together. When you put a screw through two pieces of wood to hold it together, you actually don't want the threads on the thing that you're putting it in. You want the threads to be in the thing that's actually holding it down. And so this part needs to be smooth up here. Otherwise, it's going to bind as you tighten it down. By having the smooth side here, this one doesn't create any friction, allowing the screw to go down and actually hold this very tight. So wood screws, you kind of want to match the smooth part up here to be the thickness of the wood. So this could be a little bit thick. I would probably want this smooth part to be a little bit shorter to match this piece of wood. So that's something about wood screws. This is called a lag screw, and it's for wood. And as you can see, this would be like if I was to put a 2x4, I might use a lag screw. And as you can see, that fits perfectly. That smooth part there fits perfectly with this piece of wood. Quite often when you're using screws, you're going to be using a washer also. And the reason for the washer is when you put it in and you start tightening it down, the washer does a couple things. It reduces the friction so that when this is being screwed in, it's rubbing against the washer rather than digging into the head of the wood, allowing you to get a much tighter grip. So washers are good to have. Some people ask, well, should I put the washer if I have a bolt with the nut, as an example in this case here? should I put the washer on this side or should I put the washer on this side, you know, depending on where I'm connecting it? Well, and a lot of that has to do with the way the thing is being assembled. If you're tightening the bolt on this end, then you probably want the washer on this side. If this side of the bolt here is actually going to be pushing into, say, a piece of wood or something like that, you may actually want to have a larger washer up on here to help distribute the load so it doesn't smash down into the wood. It really kind of depends on the application, but typically whatever side you're turning, that's the side you definitely want the washer on. And there can be exceptions to these cases, but in general, that's the case. There are lots of different kinds of screws. As an example, if we look at these three here, this one here is called both of these actually are sheet metal screws. They usually are fully threaded and then they have a sharp tip. This one is actually called a thread rolling screw, and it's kind of an interesting one. If you notice, it does not have a sharp tip, but it has a very coarse thread. And the reason for that is this is made to go into plastics. There's also types of screws that will actually have, I don't have one here, but I should have brought one up, I apologize, but will have a little drill bit at the end. And those are self-tapping and drilling. As you screw in, you can actually drill into metal and it'll drill and create the hole for you. So there's lots of different types of screws out there. There's lots of different types of screw heads. We'll be talking about that in a minute. And then of course, another type of fastener is a nail. Your very common nail. You know, here's an example of your standard nail that you might have seen. This nail here, this is called a finish nail. And if you notice, the difference between these two is one of them has a big head and one has a small head. The head is going to help if you pound it in, it's going to help hold whatever you're trying to connect. The finish nail is typically used for something like molding in a house or something like that, to where you actually want to hide the nail. And then you would use something like a nail set to push that in just a little bit farther. It's a kind of a punch. It'd push it in a little bit farther, then you could put some putty around it. And that's when you use a finish nail. And then there's this interesting guy. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these, but these are called a duplex nail. And they actually have two heads on it. And this is used by construction workers, typically house framers, things like that. If they'll pound this into a 2x4 to hold up a brace or something like that. And then they will use, oops, sorry, I bumped the camera. Then they can, once it's pounded in, it'll have good holding power, but then they can use their claw hammer to pull it back out. And so that's what a duplex nail is used for. If you ever see these, you never want to pound that all the way in. You will only stop to here and it'll allow you to take the nail back out again. So with all of this said, you may want to know, well, okay, I've got all these screws. When do I use which kind? And as an example, here are two bolts. And this bolt, if you notice, the thread is very coarse. This bolt, the thread is very fine. And these are actually the same type of, the same dimension of bolt. So why would I use one over the other? Well, the coarse threaded bolt works really good in soft materials. If you're using in wood, plastic, aluminum, for general use, you like to use a coarse thread. The nice thing about that is when you put a nut on, it doesn't take as many turns for it to get to the spot that you want. And it also has a lot more gripping power because these threads are very deep. Now, these threads are actually measured in what's called TPI, or threads per inch. And so something like this might be 16 TPI or 16 threads per inch. So if I measure 1 inch and I count the number of threads, this would be a 16, and it might be called like a, I think this might be like a 3/4 by 16. That means that it's a 3/4 inch diameter here. This isn't 3/4, but you know, it might be 5/8 or something, by 16-inch thread. To where the fine thread, the threads are much closer together. This might be something like a 24 threads per inch. Now, if you notice the threads per inch, if I can get real close, they're not very deep compared to like this one. They're much deeper. And why would I use a fine thread versus a coarse thread? The fine thread, because the helical spacing is much smaller, it actually has less chance of working itself free in if there's a lot of vibration or something like that. A coarse thread can actually unthread itself accidentally, to where a fine thread has less chance of doing that. Also, the fine thread, if you think about it, has a lot more surface area. When the nut is on there, there's a lot more surface area between the bolt and the nut, and so it's actually stronger. Not to mention what they call the root diameter, or the, you know, when they cut out the thread, this is how thick the bolt is right here, but when they cut the thread out, they actually thin the bolt. Well, on this bolt, because those threads cut in deeper, it's actually narrower. So this bolt, even though they might be the same size, is actually a little bit thinner inside. Therefore, it's not quite as strong. So if you've got real strength issues, things like that, a lot of times they're going to go with a fine thread. But if you've got hard materials, you'll go with the fine thread. If you're going into soft materials, you'll usually go with a coarse thread. Now, again, if you're putting nuts at the end of them, you know, maybe it doesn't matter quite as much if it's a coarse thread or a fine thread, because your threads aren't part of the material. Question?
No, Mike, I just need to stop you for a second. I'm so sorry. We have more than one person having the issue that they're only seeing April's slides. And so I need to fiddle with something for a moment. I'm so sorry, everyone.
Okay. The other thing you might do is, I don't know if you swap the two of us, if they would be able, it's more important they see me, I think, than her. Sorry,
I agree. Let's try this. What I'm doing is I am pinning both. For those of you that were having trouble seeing, let me know if that fixed it. Let's just move ahead. If anybody has the answer, because I'm on here as a participant as well, and that just changed it.
But you maybe just put me up.
Yeah, and I think what we're doing now is it's showing speaker view. So as I'm talking, I'm seeing my blank screen, and as you're talking, I'm seeing you. So that's actually quite good.
Okay.
I think we'll move forward.
Apologize for the technical difficulties.
Yeah, sorry about that, folks.
Okay, do you want to put me as the primary then? Because I'm not seeing the magic hands, I'm seeing you.
Okay. Yeah, I think I have to spotlight it. I can only do so much from my end, unfortunately. There we go. So unfortunately, we're back to the beginning because that's the only thing that works. And for Mike, for you, you obviously need to be able to see what you're doing so that we can see if your hands are showing. So let's forge ahead.
Okay. So we're back to the two. So some people may not be able to see what I'm doing then. I don't know. If
they were having trouble before, they may still be having trouble. I basically returned everything to the way it was.
Okay, should we do the spotlight and then only me and not the slides?
We can do that. Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that.
Sorry, April.
There we go. We can see your
well,
hands.
all right, so let's see, where was I? So yeah, we talked about the coarse thread and the fine thread. We talked about putting washers on. Some other things about if you're screwing into wood. Let's talk about that a little bit. If I was to take something, I've lost some of my props now. If I take something like this lag screw and I screw into this wood, especially near the edge, what's going to happen is as the screw goes into the wood, it's going to have to displace the wood. It's going to push it out of the way. Well, the problem with doing that is it's going to cause the wood to split. And a good way to get rid of that problem is, one, back away from the edge is always a good thing to do. But you can also sometimes for nails, if you're pounding a nail in and it's splitting the wood, if you actually blunt the tip, that is a great way to stop it from splitting the wood, because as it goes in, what's going to happen is instead of separating the wood, it's going to break the wood fibers as it goes through. But when you're dealing with screws, lag screws, things like that, an important thing to do is to pre-drill. If you pre-drill the hole and then you screw it in, there's less chance of the wood splitting. Now you might say, well, how much should I pre-drill? What I usually do is I look at the thickness on the inside of the bolt, not the thread part, because I still want all of the thread to go into the wood. So I kind of look at how thick this area is right in here. And then what I do is I pick a drill bit that's just a little bit smaller than that. And then when I drill this, I pre-drill the hole and I put this in, the wood typically won't split. I still want to make sure I get a good bite. It is going to push things out a little bit, but usually not enough for the wood to split. So that's a good tip, is always to pre-drill and try to find something a little bit smaller than the inner or root diameter of that screw, and you should be in good shape. The other important thing is, especially if you're going into wood, don't over tighten the screw. If you take the screw and you over tighten it too much, what will happen is it will actually, because the material that you're screwing into is soft, you can actually rip those the threads. So the wood that is going in between here, let's see, the wood that's going in between here will actually rip apart. And so, and that's a judgment call on how much to go. Just, do your best, try to not over tighten. There's another thing I wanted to mention just real briefly, and that is sometimes you're going to have a bolt that you want to cut if it's too long. What's the best way to cut it? Well, one way you can do it is you can clamp this in a vise, and then you can get a hacksaw and cut it. But the problem with clamping it into a vise is you're going to ruin the threads. What I do, a really neat trick, is I'll take a nut, then I'll take another nut, if I want to cut it right there, and I'll squish those together, and then I'll clamp these nuts in a vise like that. Now, the nice thing about this is twofold. The two nuts together actually locks the bolt from moving. It gives me a nice flat area to stick into the vise. And it also gives me a spot to where when I'm sawing, and I saw this off, it gives me an alignment point, because I usually put the nuts right at the spot where I want to cut. And so I can just follow that nut right down, cut my bolt. And then the third advantage, or fourth or fifth advantage of it is, a lot of times when you cut a bolt off, it's going to be rough at the end and you can't get the nut back on. Well, the nice thing, since the nuts are already on, when you unscrew them, they'll be a little tough right at the end. But when you unscrew them, it kind of cleans up those threads for you, and then then you'll be able to use it. And I'm going to throw in a little extra tip here. This is the advanced class. This thing kind of changed my life. This is called a thread restorer. And what it is, I don't know if you can see the numbers there. This one has 8 different threads on it. There's a 12, an 11, a 20, a 24, 13, 14, 16. That's the one I want. And then what you do is you just lay this on here and you just file it, and you can run it around and file it. And this is set to the thread pitch, the 16 thread pitch, which is what this is. So when I do that, it cleans up the threads. And this is wonderful. If you ever have a bolt that has a problem, get one of these thread restorers. They're only like $15 or something like that. And you can just sit there and file your threads, and it'll clean them right up for you. If you've never seen one of these, they're awesome. Like I say, I found one about 7 or 8 years ago, and boy, it changed my life. Made working with dinged up bolts and stuff so much easier. So that's about all I have for fasteners. Does anyone have any questions?
So Lee asks, how far into the wood do you pre-drill? And Wes is on the line and he answered, he says, do you want to pre-drill the entire length you plan to turn the screw or bolt into? Does that sound right?
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you, Wes. That's exactly right. Yeah, basically you want to, if I'm drilling and I'm going to go in that far and say this is the top 2x4 and then this is going into the wood, I would want to drill at least that far, maybe a little bit farther.
Perfect.
And sometimes you don't even have to go that much, but typically that's what you would do. Perfect.
Thanks, Wes, for helping. All right, on to the next section.
So we're going to talk about screwdrivers next. And I just want to say again, just like everything else, in fact, I'll probably say this for everything, there are so many different types of screwdrivers. It's amazing. And there's a reason why. Let's see, let me just pull some over here. And I'm also going to try to remember to tell you guys my favorite tools as I go to, the things that I think are must-haves. But, there's screwdrivers like this one here. That's for screwing around corners. Oh, no, it's not. I'm just kidding. This is actually an old speed screwdriver, so you turn it like that. It's not for going around corners. This one's for going around corners. These are really cool. If you've got an area that's off a little bit, you can get these kind of screwdrivers. Of course, you got your standard everyday flathead screwdriver. You've got your Phillips screwdriver. This one's kind of interesting. It's got a way to hold a screw at the end. You can clip that on there so you can hold the screw at the end while you're screwing in. I'll show you some better ways of doing that. And then this one here is what's called an impact driver. And what you do is you put this end on the screw that you're hit, and then you hit this with a hammer. And what it does is when you hit it with the hammer, it turns just a little bit and will help break away screws that are stuck. So an impact hammer is kind of nice. This is actually my favorite screwdriver. I recommend everybody having at least 5 or 10 of these laying around the house because they're never where you need them. This is called a multi-tool or a multi-bit screwdriver. This is my favorite one because I have lots of different choices. In this case, I have a large Phillips, a large flathead, a small Phillips, a small flathead, but I have even more than that. This particular one this works as a nut driver for one size, and on the other side is a nut driver for a different size. And I have these in my shop because otherwise I'm always got lots of screwdrivers laying around and I'm always looking for one. Here, I only have to try to find one of them, and I can just swap this around, have a different screwdriver. If I've got a nut that I need to take off, I just pop that off and I've got a nut driver. Not all of them have the dual size nut drivers. If you see the ones called 6-in-1s, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's what they're for. Some of them even you can use the handle as a different kind of nut driver. This one isn't that way, but I really like these. I highly recommend them. They're a great way to have lots of screwdrivers very quickly. Now, when we're, you'll notice this one here has a black tip on it. The black tip usually means, it doesn't always, but it usually means it's magnetic. And again, they don't always mean that, but because like I've got this one here, my old speed screwdriver, this one's so old, there's no magnetic left to it. But these are really nice if you've got a screw and you're trying to hold it, you know, it'll help you hold it. But if you don't have one of those black tip screwdrivers, a really cool thing you can do is just use a magnet. And let me grab a screw here. And my trusty screwdriver that I normally, you know, if I put a screw on there, it just falls off. But all you have to do is just put a magnet on that. And it should, well, let's see, I've got the wrong size. And I got the wrong tip. And now it'll hold it. So that's a great way, you know, if you just have a magnet, you can stick that on your screwdriver and that'll help you if you've got a tight spot and you can't hold the screw. Another thing you can do is if you've got a screwdriver that's not magnetic like that, you can also just take the magnet, rub it on it, and quite often that's enough to make it magnetic. So, you know, just give it a bit of a rub and then it'll stick to it. So you can magnetize other screwdrivers, or you can just stick it on like that if you want to hold a screw like that. So hopefully that's a useful tip. This comes in quite handy when you, you know, you're in a tight spot and you can't get your hands in there, something like that. There's another situation you may run into to where you, if you notice this screwdriver here, if you notice it's got a round shaft, so there's not much you can do there. But if you look at this screwdriver, it actually has a square shaft. And that's actually intended so that you can put more leverage on it. I can use a small wrench, I can put a wrench on that. And so if I've got a screw that's really, really tight, I can put this on there and I can use that to help me turn it. So having square shafted screwdrivers are very helpful if you've got something that's really stuck. When we talk about screwdrivers, there's, see, I'm going to have to vary this a little bit. I apologize to everyone, but we're trying to do things a little differently here now. There's lots of different types of heads, and it's really important that you match the type of head to the type of screw that you're using. So in this case, it's your standard flathead. This one is a Phillips. This one is a Torx head. And, you know, there's just hundreds and hundreds of kinds of different heads. And you might wonder, well, why do they have so many? Well, it kind of started out, the flatheads were really easy to make, and that's what they did. But the problem is they strip out real easy, especially if something's tight. It's really easy to strip. They'll kind of roll on you, and then you can't get them out. And then they came up with what they thought was a better idea, you know, and everybody's trying to improve and make something better. They came up with the Phillips, and then there's I think it's Robertson or Robertson, which is like a square head. They're always trying to improve it. So some of the reasons is there's really never been a standard, and everyone's trying to invent something better. And there's also some other reasons. They create what they call security screws, which are, some of them look like a regular flathead, but they're smooth on one side, so you can only screw it in, you can't unscrew it. You see these a lot on bathroom doors and stuff like that, and, you know, stalls in restrooms. But they also are trying to improve things because certain times they're worried about slipping and stripping out. They kind of come up with better ideas. Well, some of the problems are like something like this might be harder to strip out, but the problem is it's going to require a big wrench or something to go around the outside of it. and sometimes you've got a very narrow area. And so they came up with the Torx head, which you could put a lot more pressure on it without it stripping out, and they could keep it narrower. So there's reasons for that. For tight spaces, if they want a very tight space, they might come up with a head that's a little bit more unique. And then there's also, there's the, what I would call limiting access. You know, sometimes they want to make things such that people can't get into it. Or I've actually seen, I think it was in a laptop or a phone or something, to where they had two different kinds of screws. And the reason for that was there were the screws that they wanted you to use to take the back off of it. And then there were screws that were holding things together they didn't want you to take off. So they actually put a different kind of head on it. And it was kind of a nice warning saying you should only use this type of, you should only move the, say the Phillips screw and leave the other one alone. So there are a lot of reasons. Sometimes there's a lot of bad reasons. Some people say that the reason for all the different screw heads is so you'll never have the right type of screw driver. And that could be valid too. A few other tips about screwdrivers and screwing is, oh shoot, I lost my rubber band. How did I lose my rubber band? Boy, I'm not quite as prepared as I thought I would be. I apologize.
Well, we changed things on you too. Hey, Mike, can you slide up the measurement tools at the top of your screen? Because I think it's making your camera weird out a little bit.
Okay, there we go.
There you go.
So you might have a situation, let me find one here. I don't know who did this to this, but as you can see, here's a Phillips screw that got mangled pretty bad. And if that was in something you needed to remove, you might not be able to remove it because this thing might just keep, twisting on you because it's all worn out. So here's a kind of a cool trick you can do. If you take a rubber band and you put the rubber band over top of the screw and then put the screwdriver into it, what happens is that rubber band will actually fill up that area. And for small screws, you can even use like a little latex glove or something. But let's see if I can get this on the camera. But that rubber band helps fill up that area, allowing you to unscrew it. And you can use lots of different things, but a rubber band is kind of nice because it's stretchy and it goes into it. So that's kind of a neat way to get a screw out that, a possibility that can help you. Another situation that happens quite often, especially if you're building IKEA furniture, is you might have a screw or something like that that just kind of spins and it won't come out. And that's because it's stripped underneath. The threads are stripped. And then usually if you take a screwdriver and you go underneath of it and lift, you can get it to start coming up. And then once it starts coming up, the threads a lot of times will grab and then you can finish unscrewing it. So that's a great way to get screws out, especially in wood that's stripped. Let's see. If you have bolts and stuff that are stuck, there's a few different ways you can unstick them that work. Applying heat to it a lot of times can help it and become loose. I rarely ever use WD-40. I don't find WD-40 works that well. What I use is a chemical called PB Blaster. PB Blaster is excellent for breaking up rust and unsticking bolts. You spray that on there. It's kind of stinky stuff. Don't use it in wood. This is only for like metal that's rusted. But PB Blaster will help free up something stuck. The other thing you can do if things are stuck is you can put if you had a, if I had a stuck screw here, say it was in metal, what I could do is I could actually put my screwdriver on top of this and then, I don't know if I can get it in the camera, I could have that and then I could hit the top of the hammer, hit the top of it with a hammer. And a lot of times what will happen is that will break all of that rust free. So heating, trying impact, things like that or even using a impact driver like this can help unstick things. And of course, if they break off or something like that, you can always use a screw extractor. Something else that'll happen, I mentioned about the screw that went into the hole, you know, and it got stripped out. Well, how do you fix that? Here is a neat trick to fix it. If you just take a toothpick, wooden toothpick, break part of it off. I'll use the smaller piece here. And you put that in with the screw, and sometimes you might need both pieces of the toothpick. And what happens is that toothpick is going to fill up the gap that used to be there and build some really nice threads for you, and that's going to be good and strong. If you noticed before, that thing just slid right in and out. Now I have a nice, and if it needs bigger than a toothpick, you know, you can use a piece of wood. I don't know if I can show here. You can see what those threads did there. It really bit into that well. So that is a great way. This is how that screw fit in there before. And now with that toothpick in there, it was nice and firm. Sometimes you can even add a little bit of wood glue in, something like that if you want, but just adding one or two sides of the toothpick and then screwing that in is a fantastic way to get rid of that stripped screw problem. I think that's all I have on screws and screwdrivers. Any questions?
Nope, we're doing a really good job of keeping up with them. There was a great, you had mentioned just a slightly larger piece of wood, and somebody mentioned chopsticks. That's one I hadn't thought of for larger holes. And then I just wanted to quickly give you a time check. So we're halfway through the time.
Uh-oh, that's not good. Okay, we will go faster. Hopefully this isn't too fast for people, but there's just so many cool things. There we go. So next we're going to talk about pliers. I think what I'm going to try to do is just leave this there, and then I'll do my magic hands over top of it. What are pliers? Pliers, the definition is basically it's a pair of pivoting jaws that's used to grip, bend, cut, or hold objects. We're back to double screen.
Yeah, I think what I can do is I can just do that for a moment on each one, and then you won't have to worry about it. That might be easier for me to do that for you.
Okay. And oops, I bumped the camera again. You're really recording this, right?
We really are recording.
So these are your common pliers. They're called slip joint pliers. And that's because the joint slips like that. We have tongue and groove pliers like this. These are also called channel locks or water pump pliers. The cool thing about channel locks or slip joint pliers is whenever I bite down, the jaws are always parallel. So if I go like this, these jaws are always parallel, which is really nice, especially if I want to hold a very large nut like this. Those jaws are parallel, or if I get the right size, they're parallel. So I've got good gripping power on all sides. If I was to hold them in something like this, even if I slipped it out to where it would be larger, you know, it's not going to be parallel. I'm going to have gaps because they don't stay parallel. Then there's locking pliers. This is an example of locking pliers, also known as vice grips. They come in many different shapes. This one is made for like holding pipe or something. You know, that's why it's rounded like that, to where these are made for holding something flat. You know, there's lots of different styles of them. And the nice thing about locking pliers or vice grips is once you, again, vice grip is the brand name, just like Channel Lock is the name of the company that made them famous. The nice thing about these is once I grip something and I click the handle together, I don't have to keep holding the pressure on it. Both of these pliers, I have to keep holding pressure on to keep it in position. Vice grips are great because you can let go of them. Then there's the, let's see, that's in the next section. There are needle nose pliers. Needle nose pliers are really nice because you can get down inside of things, you know, in narrow areas you couldn't get to in other ones. These are called electricians pliers or lineman's pliers or Kleins. These, I love these. I have these on my bench all the time. They're wonderful. They're tapered at the end here because they're made for like going in pipe and smoothing out any rough edges in pipe. And electricians do that a lot with conduit. These allow you to grab here, allow you to cut wire there. They also have a wire cutter built in here to where I can open this up, stick a wire in, make a cut. Very versatile plier, very handy to have. I definitely recommend a pair of these. They have tremendous good gripping force and pulling force. They're made for like pulling wire through conduit, things like that. So they actually have a lot of grip because they're, you know, the leverage is very short here and long here, so you get a lot of grip. With channel locks, you also get a lot of gripping force. With your standard slip joint pliers, you don't have as much gripping force. You don't have the parallel. You do have the a few other features that we'll talk about in a minute, though. A pair of pliers that I really like, I ran into one day. Most of the time, I find that combination pliers don't work that well, or combination tools in general don't work well, but there's a few of them that do. And I really like these. These are a pair of needle nose pliers. It's got the wire cutter built into it, and I can flip them around like that. And now I have something that's larger for holding pipe. I've got flat joint there. So I actually have a lot of different kinds of pliers. You know, this is similar to like the slip joint plier here. Here I've got my needle nose pliers, some wire cutters, you know, very handy. This is one of the few that I found to be really, really nice to have. Like I say, most of the time when you have a multi-tool, they don't always work as well as they should. This is your standard pair of diagonal wire cutters. It's another type of plier, squeaky, but this is great for cutting wire. Highly recommend that. This is another tool that I absolutely love to have, and highly recommend it for multiple reasons. It's actually a crimper. That's what it's known to do. It's made for, if you have these style of connectors, you can actually crimp them, and they're color coded based on size. I've got red, blue, yellow. And if you notice up here, they're red, blue, and yellow. So if I'm going to crimp a red one, I would put it up here and I would crimp it. You go, well, why is that useful? I don't do that very often. Well, the nice thing is it's also got, and this is the only tool I've ever seen this on, it's got some screw cutters here. If you notice the sizes, an 832, that means it's a number 8 size. There's 32 threads per inch. 1024, a number 10 size, 24 threads per inch. 632, 440, a small one. And what you do is you just screw it in here and then chomp, and you can actually cut these machine screws. So that's really, really, really handy to have. If you do a lot with small machine screws, it's wonderful. You can also get these in metric. These also have a wire cutters at the end, as well as wire strippers. So very handy tool. You can find these at garage sales and stuff, usually for 50 cents to $1. I must have 20 of them laying around. But I find I use them all the time because quite often I want to strip wire or cut a nut or something like that. Having one of these is really, really useful. We were talking about stripping wires. over the years, I've gone through so many different wire strippers. This is some really fancy one that the jaws move while it's stripping them. Here's another one that's looks really cool that will automatically clamp, pull the wire and strip it. I've tried all of them, and these are my absolute favorite. Just get a simple pair of these. They're gauged right here on what the different wire thicknesses are. You put it in there, you squeeze, and then you pull. To me, simple in this case is better. I've tried them all. This is the one I use literally every time I strip wire. If I'm in a pinch, I'm out in the field or in the shop or something, I might use these if I have these in my tool belt. Let's see. So when should I use pliers? Well, pliers are not your first choice. If you're putting nuts and bolts together, if I'm putting things together like that, I'm not going to use pliers to do that. That's not the right job. I'm going to use a wrench to do that. And we'll be talking about wrenches in a minute. But if you're in a pinch, they can be very helpful. Certain pliers can do a lot of other things. As an example, the locking pliers, if I have a nail like this that's broken off and I want to take it out, actually locking pliers work really good. I can grab here and I can just roll it and I can pull a nail out. There's a lot of great uses for pliers like that. But for light duty, I would probably use the slip joint pliers, something like this. I've got these all around and they're useful. They've got some cool features. This one all has a wire cutter down here. I can hold pipe here. I can hold flat things here, and all of that works pretty well. But I'll go to the more advanced ones, like the linesman's pliers more often than not, or the channel locks, depending on what I'm trying to do. But if you don't have anything else, this will get the job done. I really like the tongue and groove because of the, and that's this one here, because it keeps those jaws parallel, which is really, really useful. And again, it kind of depends on your function. If you only had one pair, I might go with maybe more like a linesman plier because it gives me a little bit more flexibility. But honestly, you can't have enough tools, or at least that's what I tell my wife. And again, a needle nose plier is always very useful because you're getting into small things.
There's no questions, Mike.
No
so
questions?
Forge ahead. Yep.
That means people fell asleep or something.
No, it means you're doing such a thorough job.
Oh, that's what it means, right? I knew it was something. So the next thing we're going to talk about wrenches. As we already mentioned, if you have bolts like this with a square head, you want to be able to grab a hold of it. And probably what most people do is they're going to go to something like this, which is a crescent wrench is what a lot of people call it. Again, that's the brand name of the one that made it famous. Its more efficient name is the adjustable wrench. This one's kind of cool because if I look real close, it actually has a little measuring ability up here. So I can actually, if I want to stick it on something, I can actually use it as a way to measure. So this is not quite 1 inch. As I look at the little arrow there. But these are nice, and when you use these, I'm going to use a smaller one just so I can be on camera. It won't fit this bolt. When you use these, you always want to turn in this direction. You always want to turn down like this. You don't want to go this way. And the reason why is it relates to putting pressure on the jaws. If I go this way, this jaw here, which is the movable jaw, is getting most of the pressure. And it can actually cause it over time to get really wobbly, and you can actually strip the bolts out. You always want to go this way. You always want to take this heavy part here, and that's the part you go down on. Same way with like a pipe wrench. When you're using a pipe wrench, you always go down this way like this. If you go this way, actually with a pipe wrench, it won't work. Pipe wrenches actually have really good teeth. And if you ever are looking for used pipe wrenches, make sure the teeth are really sharp, because that's if the teeth aren't sharp, it's not going to work. And what they do is they're a little loose, and they're supposed to be that way. And then they bind, and then you can turn. But if you go this way, it'll just slip, but that way it'll turn. Pipe wrenches are nice. This is a cute little small one. I actually found this, I think, at an estate sale, and I use it all the time. It's really nice and handy to have. Let's see. So to start with, on the lowest end of things is the nut driver, the lowly nut driver. This gives you the least amount of torque. This nut's obviously too big, but if I have a nut on a stud, I'll use a nut driver. Some of them have inside here, they'll have a little magnet. Others have a hole. I prefer the ones with the hole, because if I have a nut on a stud, it'll go down inside of it instead of stopping. But nut drivers are great for just taking a nut off of something. It's a great wrench for that. Next up on the list would be your adjustable wrench. This is a good overall wrench. You can quickly adjust the size, but you do run the risk of if you don't get the size right, or if this moves, you can actually round off the edges of the nut. So these aren't the best to use, but they're probably the most common to use. Ideally, what you'd want to use is something more fixed like this. This is called an open end wrench. And it will, fit over the nut, and it gives a much better space here, because this isn't floppy at all, to where the open end wrench has a little bit of play. There's no play here, so you can grab this and you can put a lot more pressure to move it. But you are only really holding on two sides, so the better wrench to get is a closed end wrench like this. And what happens here is when it goes around the nut, it actually will support it in a lot more areas than something like an open end. And then you can get like this one, which is called a combination wrench, which has an opened on one side and a closed on the other side, or it's also known as a box end wrench, so that you can choose which one you want. These are great if you can get over the nut. Sometimes you can't, there might be something in the road. This will allow you to slide in from the side. A new invention, it's 20 years or so, but still new, is they actually now have ratcheting wrenches, which is what this is. I love these. So it's got a closed in wrench here that actually ratchets. So you can get a lot of the strength of a box end wrench like this, but you can still get the ratcheting capability. So these are always a nice set to have. And then of course if you get lucky, you can find some weird ones like this. This actually has a socket on one side and an opened in on the other side. And then every once in a while, you're going to get into a situation to where you're going to have something like this pipe, and you can get in here on this. Well, that works, but the problem is these fittings are made of brass. This happened a lot on, well, actually, you'll find this in like toilet plumbing, things like this, but it used to happen a lot on hydraulics and on trains and things. The problem is because these fittings are brass, as you can see here, it's very, very easy to roll these over and strip them out. And so they came up with a new invention, which is called a flare nut wrench. And what this is, this allows you, because ideally, right, you'd want to use a box end wrench so you could get as much on it as possible. But what the flare nut wrench does is it allows you to go over the pipe, slide it onto it. And as you can see, we're supporting that in almost every aspect of it. And so you get a lot of support, and you don't have to worry about stripping or oops, sorry about that, or smashing your soft brass fitting. The nice thing about these is you really only need like one or two of them, because there's only about two sizes. There's this size here, and then there's the one that's a little bit bigger. And if you get like one wrench like this for doing like plumbing or something, that's really all you need. And you're going to find this is a lot better than using this, because I got to tell you, before I bought a flare end wrench, I had stripped more than one like this. And if you guys want to comment in the comments for anyone that's done this, I bet you've done it too. So let's talk about the other thing that you can use, and that is the socket. And this is one of my favorite wrenches. I love this because it's got two different sizes of sockets, and it's even got a swivel handle. And so it allows me to do a lot of different choices. But this is what, you'd put it on a wrench, and then you could tighten a nut down. Now, the problem with sockets, I shouldn't say it's a problem, a feature of sockets is there's a couple different kinds. And if you look here, this one has lots of little points in it, and this one has very few. Well, why do I care? Well, you would think that maybe you would want the one with lots of choices, because then I could connect it to the bolt anywhere I wanted. But in reality, the problem is, if you look closely, again, it's about support. And I don't have a lot of support on this bolt. I'm only supporting, or on this nut, I only have a little bit of support there, 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 and there. And so I could run into the problem, especially if someone else used an adjustable wrench or a pair of pliers on this, these could be worn down a little bit, and they're not going to stick very well. And so this is called a 12-point socket, and they're nice because it gives you lots of different connection points. The better way to go, especially if you've got something in a real tight area, is to go with a 6-point socket. And as you can see, it supports the bolt all the way around, or the nut all the way around. So there's less chance of it stripping out. So what I do is, if I'm in a situation to where I'm using a socket wrench, and I've got something that's really stuck or very tight, or I have to put a lot of pressure on it, I'll go to a 6-point socket rather than a 12-point socket. If I'm in a tight area to where I don't have a lot of movement, with my wrench, and I can only go just a little bit, then I'll go with a 12-point socket, because it gives me a lot more choice. If you also notice, the wall thickness here is a lot thicker on the 6-point than on the 12-point. And that's going to make this socket a lot stronger. If you're using breaker bars or anything like that, I strongly recommend going with a 6-point socket over a 12-point socket, because I've actually broken sockets. They've cracked right down the side because they were thin and I was putting too much pressure on them. If you get a nut or something that is rounded and you can't get it off, actually try a pair of water pump pliers, or pipe wrench. Pipe wrenches will actually grab a hold of something even if it's rounded. So that's a good tip if you've got a rounded nut that you're trying to get off. Try that, or of course locking pliers will work well. That's about all I have on wrenches. Trying to go as quick as I can here.
Yep, no problem. No questions. You got 24 minutes.
Woohoo. Making progress. So I figured that you would have a question. What is a monkey wrench? Well, you use this when your monkey is loose. Oh, no, that's not right. Monkey wrenches have been around a long time. It's an old style wrench. And they basically have a parallel adjustable jaw. And what they're used for is, and they're also known as coach wrenches or Ford wrenches, because I believe the Model Ts used to come with these, because it was really nice. They only had to give you one wrench to do a lot of different choices. And it would open up extremely large And that's pretty much what they were. I think they used them as on trains, you know, the engineers used them on trains and things like that. So that's what a monkey wrench is. You can also use like this style. It was made to actually have a hammer as well as the wrench. So, you know, they're kind of a versatile tool. I've got a couple of them. I don't use them very often, but once or twice I've actually had a need because I needed to open up something really, really large, and it was kind of nice to be able to do that. They might work on other things other than monkeys too. Gorillas or orangutans, I don't know. Hammers. Well, as everything else, boy, I keep bumping the camera. I am so sorry. That's what you get for a free class. You know, the professional class, you wouldn't have all the camera bumping.
You're keeping us on our toes.
That's right. So lots of different choices for hammers. And again, just like everything else, hammers came out of necessity. You use hammers for different purposes. Probably the most common that everyone has seen is your claw hammer like this. Sometimes the claw will be straighter, and it's used for, you know, pulling nails, that sort of thing. A little hint, if you have a broken nail like this, instead of pulling it this way, if you stick this on your, hopefully I can do this for the camera. If you do it this way, and then you turn the hammer this way, you can grab a hold of that nail and turn it that way. You can bend that over and you can actually pull the nail out. So a lot of people don't realize I don't have to always go this way. I can actually go side to side. And that side to side, it's amazing how you can get a nail with a broken head out. And they're just used for, you know, pounding nails as its main thing. And then there's this thing called a carpenter's hammer. Well, what's a carpenter's hammer? Isn't that what you just showed me? This is actually different. If you look at your standard hammer, for one thing, it's a lot smaller. Carpenter's hammers are heavier. Their handles are longer. They have a bigger head, but also if you notice, the face is a standard hammer, nail hammer, has a smooth face, to where a carpenter's hammer, you know, that's got more of a waffle face. And the reason why is when a carpenter's framing a house, they need to pound the nails in fast. So they need a big heavy hammer that's going to pound it in fast. And they don't want that nail slipping. As they're pounding it in, they don't want that nail slipping off of the head. And so they have this serrated face, which will help keep that on there. Now, the problem with the serrated face is it's going to leave marks in the wood, to where this will have less chance at leaving marks in the wood. But for a carpenter that's putting up the, you know, the framing the house, the 2x4s, they don't really care about the marks in the wood. They just want to get that in there, get it in quick, get it in all the way so that they don't have any nail head sticking up. These work really good. I love a carpenter hammer. I built 2 sheds last year. This was my go-to hammer for building sheds. This, you know, when I'm putting in the siding or anything like that, my general use, I would use something like this. I do a lot of metalworking, and one of my favorite hammers for that, other than the blacksmith hammers, is a ball peen hammer like this one. And these are also called machinist hammers, and they're really used for striking chisels, punches, and shaping metal. And that's what this back thing is for. If I hit this, I can actually shape the metal by peening it, and I can bend metal around, things like that. I'll use this, and I can shape metal, and that's what the peen of the ball peen is for. A lot of times when I'm doing metal work, I don't, if I'm having aluminum or I'm having light sheet metal I'm working, I don't actually want to mar the metal. And if I'm using a ball peen hammer or any other kind of hammer, it's going to leave marks on it. And so what I'll use is something like a wooden handled hammer or a leather hammer, one of these, like a mallet, or this one's leather. I use this one a lot when I'm doing sheet metal work because it won't mark the wood. You can also use rubber mallets like this to help prevent marring of the surface that you're hitting. And that's really useful. Let's see. And of course, when you want to put a lot of pressure, when you want a lot of pounding force, say you're trying to knock something loose, I'll use a dead blow hammer. This particular one has a rubber face, but it's got lead shot in it that moves back and forth. And so the head is very heavy. So when I hit it, that lead shot comes down, puts a lot of force on it. So if I've got, like, my trailer hitch is stuck on my truck or something, I'll grab my dead blow hammer and I'll hit it, and that'll usually pop that free, to where I wouldn't want to use like one of these hammers or any of these, because if I did that, I would actually probably be damaging my trailer hitch, to where something like this, I can apply a huge amount of force and yet not damage it. Let's see. Sometimes you're going to be having a small nail like this, and you're going to want to hammer that in. And depending on your skill level, you might be having a lot of Band-Aids on your fingers. A great way to get around that is if you just take a little piece of paper and you put the nail in that paper, you can hold the nail. That hole got too big. All right. Now I can hold that nail and I can pound that in. And then when I'm done, all I have to do is just rip that paper out of there, and I can get a small nail started without worrying about smashing my fingers. And you could do this with large nails too. Anytime you're in a tight spot, maybe you're doing something very high and you're having trouble holding the nail and the hammer. If you use something like that, you can position it. Another neat trick, I'm going to mention this tool. I love this tool. This is one tool I think everybody should have. This is a center punch, but it's a spring-loaded center punch. And so if I push on it, it punches. These are great for taking the hinges of doors off. You just push up on it and it'll spring and pop that hinge out a lot easier. But these are wonderful. If I'm drilling on a piece of metal, say I have a piece of metal here. I don't know if you've ever tried drilling a piece of metal and then your drill bit's walking around on you and you can never hit the right spot. Always start with a punch. If you start with a punch where you want it, it'll leave a little tiny indentation. And now when you go to drill, that drill is not going to go anywhere. It's going to be stuck in that hole. So that's a great tip for always drilling in metal. Start with a punch. I love these spring punches. You don't need a hammer or anything. As you can see, it made a nice little dent there without having to hit it with a hammer. I just pushed down and I got it. I can use it for wood to help starting a screw, things like that. That's an extra tip. It wasn't even included in the class. Let's see. The other thing is when you're pulling a nail out, a lot of times like this, you're going to end up marring the wood, because where the hammer is touching the wood, it's actually going to indent that wood. So a sneaky thing you can do, and this also works for reducing or giving you more leverage, is if you put a piece of wood underneath that, the hammer is going to mar this wood rather than the one you're working on. So like if you're doing molding or something like that in a house, always, put something in between your hammer and the thing that you're pulling the nail out of, and it'll save that thing that you're working on.
Yeah, 15 minutes and no questions.
Okay. The other thing is if you've got a pipe or something like that that you're going to try to hammer into position, obviously you wouldn't want to do that, but if you did something like that and you were trying to pound that down, that's going to mar this surface really bad and deform it. A great thing to do is just put a block of wood on top of it, and then when you hit it, it's not going to hurt this surface near as much. It's going to, this is going to cut into here. So, using a block of wood between what you're hammering is a great way to protect that thing that you're hammering. So nothing else on hammers. We will move to saws. Hopefully everybody's getting something out of this. My goal is that everyone learns at least one thing. And since it's an hour and a half, maybe two things would be even better. Saws. Lots of different types of saws. The most common everyone probably knows is a panel saw. They're great for cutting wood. They actually come in a couple different types. Most people don't realize this, but panel saws can either be they can either be rip saws or they can be crosscut saws. And what that means is, and it relates to how the tooth is made on the saw. Saw teeth are just like, they're measured in TPI or teeth per inch, just kind of like threads of a bolt are, where this is threads per inch, it's teeth per inch. And what will happen is they actually have a special design of a tooth to where if you're cutting in the direction of the grain of the wood, you want to use a rip saw, and it's made for cutting that way. And it's kind of interesting, if you use a crosscut saw, which is made for cutting across the grain, that's why it's crosscut. If it's cutting across the grain and you try to rip, say a 2x4 this way, which you don't do that often, but if you try to cut that way, you're going to find it's not going to cut very well. And you're going to go, oh, there's something wrong with my saw. No, it's the way the tooth is made. The tooth is made to actually cut across the grain. And through probably years of experience, they figured out, oh, if I make the tooth this way, it cuts this way really well, but it doesn't cut as way that way as well, or the other way around. And then some of them are called combinations, and then they do each of them reasonably well. But just in case you're cutting with the grain and it's not cutting well, it's probably because you're using a crosscut blade on and you're trying to do a rip. So that's important to know. And if we're getting back to the panel saw here, the panel saw is really good for cutting things like plywood and stuff, and paneling, that sort of thing. And the nice thing about it is the blade is the same thickness all the way along the back. And so it'll keep cutting down something that's very long. And it's got a wide enough blade that it usually cuts reasonably straight. But if you really want to cut straight, you use a back saw like this. And what a back saw is it's got a wide blade here, and it's also got a very stiff, it's got a stiffener on the back of the blade here. And what that does is that prevents that blade from flexing. If you remember, you've probably seen videos, or maybe you've done it yourself. People actually play panel saws like a musical instrument, because they bend and wobble and make all kinds of weird sounds. But with a back saw, also known as a tenon saw or a dovetail saw, these kinds of saws are a miter saw. They don't have any flexibility this way. And so when you're cutting, they're going to cut very straight. But unfortunately, I can't go very deep because I'm stuck here. But this is great for if you're cutting molding or something like that. You want to use a back saw like this because it'll help you cut a nice straight cut. Also, when you're sawing, what I like to do, if you notice the teeth here, in this case, they're pointing forward a little bit. I don't know if I can show that very well, but if I put my saw down, the cut stroke is going to be forward rather than the back on this particular saw. What I'll usually do is I will draw the saw back. If I have my line, like this is my line here, I'll put that right on my line and I'll draw back. And what that does is that's going to make a cut line here that as I go forward, it's going to keep following that line and it's going to help me. It's also going to break the wood grain on the very top initially very, very carefully in a way that it's going to hopefully stop any splintering, things like that. Some other things you can do if you are cutting something and it's splintering on you, you can put like masking tape or painter's tape over top of it and then make the cut, and that will usually prevent the splitting. Quite often as you cut all the way through a piece of wood, when you get to the back side, back on the bottom side, you're going to get a lot of splintering. And that can happen in any kind of material, even plastics and things like that. A great way to get around that is actually to clamp, and I should have we'll say I'm cutting this board here. I'm going to be cutting this top board. what I would do is I would clamp this top board onto this board. And now when I cut through here, when it gets down to this board at the very end of the one I'm trying to cut, I'm not actually just cutting into air, I'm cutting into this one. So this becomes a sacrificial board. And that's actually going to prevent the bottom of this from splitting out. And so now I'm going to get a nice smooth finish on the back side because I've clamped it to another sacrificial board. So that's another hint to prevent splitting. Let's see. This is a keyhole saw here, and this is used quite often for drywall. The nice thing about this is it's got usually a very rough blade on it, very coarse blade, but you can just push this right into drywall. You don't have to drill a hole or anything. You can just push that in and this will cut the drywall very quickly. This is called a coping saw. Some people call them hand scroll saws. And what they're used for is cutting wood. And because the back on it is not very thick, it allows you to actually turn corners and stuff. So I can actually cut a circle out. And this saw is kind of cool because as I'm cutting, I can keep moving the blade. So here, now the blade is pointing this way. So I can keep, you know, I can keep cutting a circle and I can keep this out of the banjo here. I can keep this out of the way as I keep cutting. I can keep moving this around. So this allows me, you know, if I wanted to, what I could do is just quickly take this handle off, take the blade, push it through a hole here, and now I can cut and I don't have to drill or I don't have to cut in from the side. I can just push this blade right through that hole and I can cut a circle and I can keep moving this so it stays out of my way. So coping saws are kind of nice. Something similar to a coping saw for metal. This is called a jeweler saw. And I have a kind of a hate-hate relationship with them. It's kind of like the coping saw. It's got, as you can tell, a very, very fine blade. I think I've broken a lot of blades. It's they break very, very easily. But the nice thing is, if you're cutting like brass plate or something like that, usually you have a jig and you put your saw in there and you can cut metal. And so I can scroll out metal and stuff with a jeweler saw. Then of course there's the standard hacksaw. And Tara wanted me to mention there's a lot, unfortunately, there's a lot of different ways to replace the blade on a hacksaw. Some of them have a little handle up here. You just flip it up and it loosens it. This one, there's a little wing nut here. There's a lot. I can't really tell you how to change the blade on a hacksaw. There's so many different kinds, but hacksaws are used for cutting metal. This is a hacksaw blade. As you can see, it's a very fine tooth blade, and it's made for cutting metal. It's usually a bimetal blade. It means it's a special metal made for cutting metal. And I love this little saw. I've actually got a couple small hacksaws that I really like. This is really neat. It's just a little tiny handle and you just slide a blade into it. It's great for getting into small areas when you're trying to cut. Something I keep on my tool belt when I'm working outside a lot is this one. I love this. This is just another kind of hacksaw blade. I can set it to different dimensions, but it allows me to get in and cut metal if I've got something I need to cut, like if I want to cut a bolt off or something like that, I can use something like this, and it folds up so it's nice and out of the way.
I'm gonna cut in one more time. I got 4 minutes, and I'm actually gonna drop the survey link in the chat now.
Okay. Another example of a hacksaw handle that I really like these small ones. Very, very easy to get in and use. As I mentioned with hacksaw, or with all the saws, it's really important to pick the right kind of blade type. The one thing I do want to mention on the blades is, there's fine blades, coarser blades, really coarse blades. And what you really want to do is you want to have like 2 or 3 teeth in the material you're cutting. So something like this, that would be okay. There's at least 2 or 3 teeth in there. But if I was to use this blade to cut this piece of metal, what's going to happen is that blade is going to stick in between those teeth, and it's going to rip. And it's going to rip the teeth off of the blade, and it's not going to work well. So you always want to find 2 or 3 teeth. So I would pick something more like this. This looks like it's got at least 2 teeth in it, and that's going to allow me to cut. So that's all I wanted to mention there. And it's, when you're sawing, it's better to take long, smooth strokes rather than a bunch of little short ones. Take long, smooth strokes, and it'll help you cut smoother. And again, the slides that you guys will have available has all of this information on there. I wanted to get to 2 other things. For if you need to drop off, I understand. I've only got about maybe 6 or 7 minutes, if that's okay, Tara. For those that want to stay, I definitely appreciate it. For those that want to leave, I totally understand. Apologize, we've gone a little long. A few technical difficulties. I wanted to talk about measuring. There's some really cool measuring things I wanted to show you. One of my favorite things I initially never thought about, but is I think they call them a sewing tape or a tailor's tape. I use this in my shop all the time. I love it. And when I talk about my shop, I have a double car garage that I do a lot of metalworking and woodworking and stuff like that. CNC machining and all kinds of things. I've got a lathe, and so I'm always doing projects. But this is great because you can wrap around things. So if you've got round objects, something as simple as a tailor's tape. I like the plastic style ones. They hold up better in my dirty shop. That's great for wood and stuff too. It's just a quick measurement. Obviously, you've got simple rulers that you can use, squares and all kinds of things like that. And then there's the ubiquitous tape measure. And I wanted to show you a couple things about the tape measure. Some people think they're broken because this little tip moves. That's actually not the case. If they move, that means it's doing the right thing. It's doing a good job. The reason why it moves is, if you notice the end of this tape, there's some thickness to this metal, right? Right there, there's thickness to the metal. Well, these tapes are made to where you can push in or you can pull out. Well, it has to compensate for that thickness. So if I'm going this way, it pulls out and I can get the right measurement. And if I'm going this way, I can push in and I get the right measurement. So it does need to move based on if I'm pulling or I'm pushing. The other thing is that most tapes have a dimension, like this one says 3 inches. If I'm measuring in between a windowsill or something, I can push this side to one side of the windowsill, and I put the back of the tape to the other side of the windowsill. I measure what the distance is right here, and this would be 6 inches. And then I would add 3 inches, and that's 9 inches. So it's always good to know what the thickness of your tape is. It's always written if it's used that way. You can use that, and then you can determine an inside measurement very quickly. This tape measure has an interesting feature. There's that little slot there. That's actually useful. That's like if you pounded a nail in, that's made to hold that nail head on like that. In my metal shop, I actually have tape measures that have magnets at the end of it. And it's very easy for me to just stick and grab something on a piece of metal. So you can get tape measures to do all different kinds of things for you. But again, that hook is supposed to move like that. And there's a couple extra features there. You can also use the hook as a scribe. Sometimes they're sharp to where you can actually move it back and forth and mark what you're working on. Another measuring tool that is not necessary, but I highly recommend, is a simple little caliper. And again, you can get something like this at Harbor Freight really cheap. These things are wonderful for more precision measurements. The other things aren't quite as precise. This one is much more precise. And it actually has a couple different ways you can do measurements. Not everyone knows how to use all of the different measurements. I can go to the outside like that and measure very accurate to the 0.001 inches. If I wanted to measure the inside, I use these up here. And that'll be, again, to the 0.001 inches. Now, the nice thing is I don't have to recalibrate because it's predetermined that this dimension and this dimension here and here are always the same. So it's really cool. I just stick it in, tells me what the dimension is there, stick it in, tells me what the outside dimension is. You can also use it on this end for determining the depth of something. So if I just push that in like that, that is also calibrated and tells me what that depth is. And then there's a step over here. And I hope I'm giving it enough time for the lag. If this is sitting there, I can push it to there. And this distance here is measured exactly the same. And right now, this dimension here from this edge to this edge, the outside of those, the inside of those, and this depth, they're all exactly the same at, we'll call it whatever it is, 0.9 inches. So calipers are very useful when you're trying to get into a little bit more accurate measurement. They're very, very nice to have, and you can use them in a lot of different ways to measure things more accurately. So one last thing I'll tell you about measurement that I think is kind of cool. We're almost done, I promise. Is if you're trying to figure out the distance halfway between something, say I've got this piece of metal here, and I want, see, let me raise it just a little bit. There we go. And I want to figure out the distance halfway between it. I got a problem because this darn thing is not the right dimension, right? It's not 4 inches, it's 3 7/8 inches. Well, what's half of 3 7/8? I can never remember. Well, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold it at an angle, and I'm going to put this at 4 inches here. I'm going to put it even there. I'm going to put it at 4 inches there. And so if I go to half of 4 is 2, that's the center. Now, some of you are going to go, that's not right. Trust me, play around with it. It actually works. And the other cool thing is if I want to divide this into fourths, I can just put a mark there at 1, a mark here at 3. And that is exactly divided into quarters. And I didn't have to try to figure out that this is 1 15/16 or something like that. And then the other cool thing is I can actually do that again this way, because the only downside of this is that your marks aren't in an even line, but I could do that again this way. Oh, what do you know? It measured out the same. I could put another 1 there or one other 3 there. Now I got 2 lines. I can come back. And I can mark those. So anyway, that's kind of a cool tip for measuring anytime you have, the key is these have to be parallel sides, obviously, but just remember, you don't have to have the ruler straight across. You can put the ruler at an angle, and whatever those distances are, you can divide them equally. So you don't have to use 4, if this is long enough, like this 2x4, I could do it at 6 inches if I wanted to. And so halfway is 3. I could do it at 4 inches. Halfway is 2. Any way I want to. But I can set it up to where those numbers are the way I'd like to do it. The last thing I'm going to show is a lot of times, even in home ownership, you want to be able to connect 2 small pieces of metal together, and screws and stuff don't work really well for this. So, if they're thin. So what I use is pop rivets. I love pop rivets. I use them all the time. And what a pop rivet is, it's kind of like a metal nail here, and it's got a bump on the head, and then it's usually aluminum here. And what happens is you've got a pop rivet gun, and these are really inexpensive. They're only, like 20 bucks or something like that. And when you put that in there, the gun will pull this nail, expanding it, and then it will make a connection like that. And then that nail breaks off automatically. It expanded it on that side, and now I've got a connection. So I can take, and all you have to do is just drill a hole to what you want. You put your pop rivet in. Put your gun on there. And then I pull the handle, trying to get it all in frame here. And I don't know if you can see, but it's expanding. And sometimes you have to pull it a couple times. It broke the little nail off. And now I've got a really nice connection. And this works really good because I can do this blind. If I can't get to the back of the metal here, I can just use the pop rivet gun right on the front and put that down. You can do this with leather and all kinds of stuff. Typically, if you do that, it wouldn't be this big. You'd use a small washer. But the nice thing is you can use a small washer behind it. And then when it expands, that washer is going to distribute the load so it won't pull out of the metal. And then you've got all different sizes. This gun, I have this size in there currently, but I could put the head in. I just unscrew this and put this head in for larger pop rivets or even smaller pop rivets or the next size. So that's pretty much all I have. The slides have a few more things. It talks about some of the chemicals that I like to use quite a bit. In the future, we'll do more. If I can get a class together, maybe we'll talk about how to do metal cutting, a bunch of different choices there. Some keys on how to do filing. And I'm not talking about paper filing. I'm talking about using files and rasps. And we can also talk about more in depth on how to do tapping and taps and dies and thread cutting and that sort of thing.
Excellent.
I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. I was saying as you were kind of running through the end there, there was a lot of chatter in the chat box about just so many cool tips and tricks. So thank you very much. And everybody will get, there's a survey link in the chat, and you'll actually get a survey after the class as well. So thank you all so much for coming, and we appreciate your time, and we hope you enjoyed it.